Do you guys remember when Godzilla and Kong used to be fascinating, thought-provoking metaphors, symbolism for such interesting and devastating topics like racism, colonialism, the horrors of nuclear war? Nah, me neither, because I just saw Godzilla x Kong, The New Empire, which may be the biggest, dumbest, loudest, most obnoxiously over-the-top stupid film I've ever seen. And I say this with no hyperbole. This might be the greatest film I've ever seen. The trajectory of the Monsterverse from Gareth Edwards' 2014 Godzilla film to this new Godzilla x Kong movie is maybe the most hilariously over-the-top, absurd, just descent into chaos, insanity, and just pure unbridled nonsense. Colorful, over-the-top, insane nonsense. So many times in this movie, I just looked at my mate and I was like, I can't believe this film exists. I genuinely can't believe that we have a film that is so big budget, so visually spectacular, and so overly just unapologetically silly and dumb and fun. This movie is so much fun. We went from maybe the most grounded, gritty American Godzilla film we'll ever get, where they showed scale and scope and wonder. And we have descended so quickly in 5 films to having a film that is 80% in the Hollow Earth, in a completely visual effects CGI universe where there are just giant monsters all over the place. The people in this film have been cut to the bare bones. We've got the stupid, unfunny conspiracy theorist guy from Godzilla Kong. We've got the Kong Whisperer and her little daughter. They are the only characters existing from other films. And then we have one new character. They only introduced one new character because they're like, no, people don't want to see people talking or interacting or having any kind of arcs or themes or just saying words. They don't want to see that. They just want to see really big monsters in the Hollow Earth, just running about, punching things, fighting things, roaring at each other. The script of this film, if you got rid of what happens and it was just the dialogue, it'd be 4 pages. And I love it. But also, they introduced one new character, and it might be the first and only good character, because we've gotten to the point where there is a character in this movie, and he's a dentist. King Kong's dentist. Dan Stevens plays King Kong's dentist. There's a scene where he pulls out one of King Kong's teeth. That is the glorious, absurd universe that they have created. It's a joy to behold. I genuinely can't believe something like this exists. It is so funny. It is so stupid. It is so absurd. The technology has just completely gone out of control. It's like the MCU, where it starts off and Iron Man's like, I just built this suit and I can fly about a bit for a little bit of time. And then it gets to a point where he clicks his fingers and the suit appears out of nothing from impossible nanotechnology. And they're in space and they're fighting aliens and monsters and magic and all that stuff. It's like that. But the MCU took 20 films to get that crazy. This took 4. This took 4 films to become maybe the most unhinged, insane film ever made. I love this film so very much. This movie just fully embraces the absurd, insane nature of this universe. I feel like in so many of the other films, there have been moments where I'm like, oh, I really would have enjoyed to see this explored or that explored. Like at the end of Godzilla 2, Godzilla has a bunch of titans all around him and they're bowing to him and they're like, you're the king of the monsters, Godzilla. And Godzilla's like, rah. But then in the opening titles of Godzilla vs. Kong, we see a weird knockout sports kind of CGI illustration showing that they've both killed all the other titans and now it's just these 2 alpha titans versing each other. And it's like, it's kind of fun to show that these are the 2 most badass alpha titans or whatever. But I want to see other monsters. I want to see other titans. I want to see everything. I want to see unbridled chaos in a universe in which there are titans just roaming about. And we get that in spades. That's all this movie is. It is just so gloriously fun. They just fully lean into this crazy, crazy world. If you're a fan of this franchise and these movies and the descent into chaos, insanity, and just pure hot nonsense, you are going to absolutely love this film. I truly think it is a far superior film to Godzilla vs. Kong. This film does everything you got in that film, but bigger, more, crazier, but funner. It doesn't get so big you're like, that's too much. It just does so many wild, creative, interesting things. So much of this film is set in the Hollow Earth. It is so beautiful and vast and insane. There are some really fun and interesting turns in the Hollow Earth. There is some really, really creative ways that the fights and the action take place. They use all the elements they set up in the first time we went in the Hollow Earth in Godzilla vs. Kong, but they just take it so much further. There are some just gorgeous, incredible visuals. It is incredibly CGI visual effects heavy, but it never gets to the point where it's dizzying or confusing. You can always see the action. You can always understand what's going on. I think it does this really, really good job of keeping you invested, despite there being long 5 to 10 minute chunks throughout the whole film in which no humans speak. It's just monsters screaming and roaring at each other, and they get so much emotion out of the eyes, out of the facial expressions. And whilst I've made jokes about the fact that this film is just giant monsters punching and there are no themes and there's no substance to it, that's not true at all. There is a human story and a Kong story, and the theme of it is finding your home, like finding a place where you belong, finding family, and it is surprisingly emotional on the Kong side of things. I think the human stuff is totally fine. I thought it was way more interesting than any other movies. They do some really wild things in the back half, and I just had a lot of fun with it. It's the most fun I've had with the humans, and that is mostly due to Dan Stevens. He is so much fun as King Kong's dentist. I loved him so much. He's really, really fun. And even the unfunny, horribly unfunny comic relief, crazy nutjob conspiracy theory podcast guy from Godzilla vs. Kong, that whole subplot with him and Millie Bobby Brown and the guy from Hunt for the Wilder People, that was so unfunny. And when he rocks up the first 5-10 minutes, it's pretty grating. It's pretty like, oh, I was having fun with this movie, and now this guy's in it. By the end, I didn't hate him. And I think that's a lot for a character that I actually hate. I didn't hate him now. I still don't like him, but I didn't hate him. But despite me loving this film, I think there are 2 issues in this film. Even though I don't think they're really issues, they're just creative decisions with due to making the story and the plot like this and kind of going so far deep into the world in this way that it loses 2 things that made some of the other films really, really good. And the first one is a sense of scale, a sense of scope, and a sense of how big are these creatures? Because we spend literally 80% of this movie in the Hollow Earth, in which there are just vast, giant landscapes, all visual effects landscapes. And it looks brilliant and gorgeous, and I love all of it. But there are no humans running about. There are no human cities. There are no things that ground you in reality to show you a sense of scale for these creatures. A lot of this film, with Kong running through the Hollow Earth, kind of reminded me of watching one of the new Planet of the Apes movies, where it's like, yeah, I know he's really big, but right now, is he? Like, is he really big? And there's like a moment where like, he like meets the little girl from the other movie, and she like touches, like her whole body is the size of his little like pinky. And it's like, oh, that's right. He's really big, but you don't really get a sense of scale and scope in this film whatsoever until right at the end. But even then, the way they shoot it and frame the action and the monsters and the destruction, it doesn't really have that same weight and emotional feeling and sense of true horrifying scale of how big these things are. And I think that if Gareth Edwards' Godzilla film hadn't been so successful in creating such a wonderful sense of scale with so many gorgeous, iconic, beautiful shots, honestly, I feel like the more I look back on Gareth Edwards' Godzilla, the more I'm impressed by how incredible that film is, how amazing his sense of scale is. It's unbridled. It's unlike anything I've ever seen. But I personally don't want that to be the same for every film. We've got that film. I could just rewatch that again and again and again, which I do all the time. And then the next film, it gets a little bit bigger, a bit grander. And then by Godzilla vs. Kong, it's just nonsense and stupid. But it's not stupid enough. And then in this movie, we've hit that moment, that glorious moment where it's just those old Godzilla movies, those old insane Japanese movies with just 50 monsters just flying about, destroying stuff, and it's just chaos. Nonsense chaos. For their size, they move way too quickly. It doesn't make any sense. But I don't want it to make sense, because I have the films that make sense. I can go back and watch Gareth Edwards' Godzilla. I can go and watch -1. But then we also have this movie with the budget and the effects and just it's just so colorful and wonderful and insane. And yeah, it's just really good. So it is an issue, the sense of scale in this film. It's non-existent. We're barely on the surface of Earth anyway. And even the times we do get it, there's a bit of a sense of scale, but it's also just insane. It's essentially the back half of the Fast and Furious franchise, where it's like, sure, you can compare it to the first movie and be like, how did this happen? This is so dumb. Or you can be like, how did this happen? This is so dumb. I love it. There is one other thing that I think some people, especially half the community of people loving these movies, are going to find a real big issue with, and that is Godzilla's screen time. Godzilla isn't really in this movie that much at all. Now, I personally absolutely love Godzilla, but I really love King Kong. I've always loved King Kong. I love King Kong ever since Peter Jackson's movie came out, and then I revisited the original. I just love that movie, and so I've grown up loving King Kong. I haven't really watched that many of the Japanese Godzilla films, and so until this franchise, I didn't really have a Godzilla guy that I enjoyed. I really kind of got into him when Gareth Edwards' film came out. So I've been a King Kong fan essentially for 10 years longer, and I just love the big ape. I love the idea of Skull Island. I've always loved the idea of King Kong fighting dinosaurs, and now we get a different King Kong who's fighting monsters in the Hollow Earth. It's so unique and special and wild, and I love the design of this new King Kong. Kong Skull Island, despite all its many glaring flaws, is an absolute delight. That first helicopter sequence, just spectacular. So I love Kong, and I think if you're pitting Godzilla and Kong against each other, for me at least, it makes sense if you're going to humanize one of them and make them the hero, if you will, and the other the villain. It makes sense to make the big monkey the hero, because you can kind of just connect with him more. But also, I just connect with him more generally, so I'm okay with that idea. And then you make the giant lizard, the one that looks like a horrifying dinosaur monster that shoots lasers, you make him the villain. And whilst he's not necessarily a villain in this one at all, they still do position Kong as the hero. This film is Kong's film. He is the main character by far, to the point where I don't really think it should have been called Godzilla X Kong. I mean, I understand they had to do that to get both people in, but it almost feels insincere. It almost feels like you're tricking the audience. And I don't even know why it's called Godzilla X Kong, because why is it an X? Godzilla times Kong? Godzilla multiply Kong? I don't get it. It might be because I don't understand algebra, like it's some kind of math reference, but that doesn't make sense to me either. Regardless, I don't understand what's going on with the X. Is the next one going to be called Godzilla Z Kong? Are we just missing letters? And then the fourth one will be Godzilla B Kong? Are we going back to the start? I don't get it. But what I don't get more is that it's called Godzilla X Kong. Because Godzilla's not in this movie, at all. It is Kong's movie through and through. This film should have been called King Kong: Journeys to the Center of the Hollow Earth, featuring Godzilla. Godzilla's also here. Kinda, not really. But don't get me wrong, every single moment with Godzilla I thought was visually spectacular and really interesting and super cool. He lives and sleeps in the Colosseum. It's really fun. But he's not in this movie at all. I'm a massive Kong fan, and I saw it with one of my best mates, and he's the biggest Godzilla fan I've ever met. He was so annoyed. He was so annoyed. There are some weird side creature monsters that I don't want to spoil here. They're in the trailers, but I don't want to spoil it. But they get more screen time than Godzilla. Way more. There's a point in this film where I'm I could just feel him just being been 25 minutes since Godzilla, what's going on here? And I have to be honest, even I, someone who just wants to see a Kong movie and doesn't care, still think Godzilla kind of got dogged in this movie. I think there's maybe one or two more moments in the first half they needed to give him to just give us that sense of they're both in this movie. Because if you follow Kong for 15 minutes and no humans speak and it's just an ape running about in the Hollow Earth, and then you cut to Godzilla for a minute, then cut back to Kong for 15 more minutes, it's a little unfair just for people who want to see Godzilla. But personally, I didn't mind it that much, even though I can't argue he's not in this film, because he's not in this film that much. But regardless, I think if you're going to pick one of them to focus on, emotionally, it makes sense for Kong. And if you see the story they're telling, which I don't want to spoil the second and third acts and what happens, but, Kong's journey is more interesting, and they humanize him in really fun and interesting ways. And they do some things where it sets up a moment where you're oh, cool, so this is what the film's going to be. But then it kind of spins and turns, and we get maybe the most hilarious fight I've ever seen in my life. I thought it was so good. I love this movie so very much, and I personally cannot wait for Godzilla Z Kong: Monsters Back into Hood.